You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 30th of October 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and a warm welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 2 here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and coming up on today's programme, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris push towards voting day with two major rallies. We'll ask our man in Washington whether anything will change between now and next week. Also coming up...
And I'll be looking at what to expect from the first UK budget from a Labour Chancellor in 14 years. Will there be a rabbit?
Bloomberg's Ewan Potts will join me with his crystal ball to look ahead at the UK budget, which could shape Labour's time in power. Plus,
now with all the votes counted in each one of the 5,570 Brazilian cities, we can finally predict what to expect for the 2026 Brazilian presidential elections.
Fernando Augusto Pacheco will bring us more on Brazil's mayoral elections a little later. And we hear from the author of a new book which claims to rewrite the way we should look at geography and its influence. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. Donald Trump has, rather unsurprisingly, told a rally of supporters in Pennsylvania that Kamala Harris doesn't have what it takes to be president. He was speaking shortly after Harris urged voters to turn the page on the drama and conflict in politics. Meanwhile, Donald Trump may have been given a boost by footage that's emerged of Joe Biden appearing to call Donald Trump supporters garbage. Well, Chris Chermak is Monocle's senior news editor. He joins us live from Washington, D.C. to bring us the latest on all three stories. Chris, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Emma. What a way to go into the final 7 days of the campaign when you lay it all out like that.
Well, you couldn't really expect it to be incredibly calm. But so let's begin as we have done in the last few hours when you've actually been at the Kamala Harris rally. What's been the sort of the general takeaway from her performance?
You know, it's interesting, Emma, for me personally to go to a rally of Kamala Harris's at the Ellipse, just because it had been a while since I'd been to a rally of, a major presidential candidate. And this felt like, worthy of comparison in that sense to some of these previous ones, whether it was Obama's final pitches or Trump's, obviously, as well, because we are entering these final 7 days. This was her closing argument. And yet the mood, I would say, to be fair, was something of a mixed bag. It was not the highest energy I've seen at an election rally, although there were estimates of around 50,000 people who came out. Maybe part of the reason for that was that right at the center of the rally, if you will, or of the staging, right in front of a big jumbotron screen, were a large group of pro-Palestinian protesters who really sucked a lot of energy out of the group around them because they were very loud and disrupting the speech. But that in itself does go to show this kind of mix right now. There's a lot of tension in the air, I think, among Harris's voters as well. A lot of worry right now whether she is going to pull this across the line. And that's really something that you felt, I think, as she was trying to make these final 7 days, about Donald Trump, about the threat that he poses to American democracy, but also more about who he is. And that's something that she pivoted to very quickly in her speech last night.
And that is something that actually she is at a disadvantage with, because when it comes to her delivery and her energy, there are moments when she hits top notes, but on other occasions, she still lacks that just brute force that Trump has when he's commanding a room full of 50,000 supporters of his own.
I think that's right, to be honest, Emma. I mean, you just feel that difference, and you see it to some degree, I would say, when you watch some of these rallies, when you watch the energy in a Donald Trump room for whatever, you want to say about what he says. The energy is extremely high among his supporters. And by comparison, yes, her delivery was not quite as strong on that. She hit all the important notes, but it did feel like very much a calculated speech from her about what she had to get in at this this point, and you could almost hear some of the comments ahead of it from advisors and what had been said about what she should be saying at this point, particularly this idea that, even though she was speaking at the ellipse, the point where Donald Trump told his protesters that the election had been stolen and basically set off the insurrection of January 6th, she mentioned that moment. She talked about it at the beginning, the fact that Donald Trump wanted to take American democracy away, and then very quickly pivoted to everything else in her speech, focusing more on his character and then focusing on what she wanted to do in the country. And obviously, that is extremely important, but at the same time, I don't think she managed to quite grab the gravitas of this moment the way that, say, a Joe Biden would. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's important. A lot of people out there, frankly, don't care as much about democracy. It's not the issue that polls the highest, but I think it does go to show this a little bit of disconnect also in her campaign. She picks a place like that to give a final speech, but then that is not actually her closing argument.
You mentioned Joe Biden seizing attention and commanding us all to listen. He may have handed Donald Trump an absolute gift in the last week of the campaigning for all the wrong reasons.
These are very interesting, aren't they, Emma? Because I think there's a lot of comments that have dominated these last couple of days that we could focus on. And I think it's interesting how certain things develop, also because it's the surrogates. Donald Trump himself is getting into hot water, not because of what he said, but because of what a comedian, Tony Hinchcliffe, said at Madison Square Garden about Puerto Rican, the island, being an island of garbage. This somehow has created a firestorm of media coverage over the last 2 days about what Donald Trump means by that, or what his supporters mean by that, how denigrating this is to Puerto Ricans, despite the fact that much of this, to be perfectly frank, has been quite known. You can look at Donald Trump's reaction to when Puerto Rico had storms to get a sense of kind of what he thinks of certain people around the country. And yet this is the focus of the final days of the campaign. And that leads into Joe Biden's remark as well, because he was responding to the remark about Puerto Rico being garbage and said, the only garbage that I see floating out there is his supporters, his demonization of Latinos is unconscionable. Now, we think this may have been one of these unfortunate Joe Biden flubs. What he meant to say is the garbage I see is this supporter being the comedian and his demonization of Latinos. But the way it came out is something that certainly Donald Trump and his surrogates have absolutely pounced on, saying Biden called our supporters garbage. This is something that, both sides at this point are absolutely looking for any edge that they can get. And if a comment like that can rally people to the polls from their own side, it harkens back to Hillary Clinton's deplorables comment back in 2016. Then this is something they're going to use, whatever the realities may be around that. Donald Trump has, of course, also referred to the enemy within many, many times, and vermin and other things about the other side in this election of Democrats as well. So this is something that Kamala Harris focused on. Both sides are focusing, it's fair to say, I suppose, on the rhetoric right now, what the other side thinks of them, what they think of you. That is one way to try and get out the vote at this late hour.
Chris Chermak in Washington, thank you. You're listening to The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. The time here in London is 8 minutes past midday. A quick look now at the latest other news headlines. Here's Laura Kramer.
Thanks, Emma. The European Union's tariffs on Chinese-made electric cars have come into effect today. These tariffs, up to 45%, are in response to findings that Beijing was giving its car makers unfair financial help, making it harder for European car companies to compete. Canada has accused India's Minister of Home Affairs, Amit Shah, of leading a campaign to threaten Sikh activists. Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, had earlier said there's credible evidence of Indian government involvement in the killing of Canadian Sikh activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar. And North Korea's foreign minister is leading a delegation to Russia, though the reason for the visit is not clear. South Korea's spy agency suspects the discussions may involve North Korea possibly sending more troops to Russia and negotiating what it might receive in return. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Emma.
Thanks, Laura. Let's get a roundup now of some of the day's business stories with Ewan Potts from Bloomberg. A very good afternoon to you, Ewan. We are moments away from the first Labour budget in 14 years.
Hello, Emma. Yes, it has been a very long time coming. I don't mean the 14 years. I mean the gap between the general election and budget day. 4 months, which is an exceptionally long time. And it has been filled with endless speculation, mostly about who's going to get landed with a very large tax bill. Now, Labour blame their predecessors for leaving a so-called black hole in the government's finances, which they say is £22 billion. The Conservatives dispute that figure. But either way, the government's finances are very tight, and the Chancellor's options for raising cash are very limited. At the election, the party promised not to raise income tax, national insurance, that's a payroll tax, VAT, a sales tax, or the rate of corporation tax. Now, the problem is that those are the big four revenue raisers. They make up about 70% of the tax take in the UK. So the Chancellor is really quite boxed in her options for raising money. What we do know is that there's going to be a rise in employers' national insurance. So that's a payroll tax paid by all companies. And that's likely to rise by somewhere between 1% and 2%. Currently, it's 13.8%. That's going to raise a lot of money. A 1% rise gets you about 8.5 billion, and 2%, obviously twice as much as that. We think overall in the budget, she's likely to go for a total of about £35 billion in extra taxes and in spending squeezes. So you can see that big fundraising measure gets quite a lot of money. There's been lots of argument over whether that breaks Labour's pledge not to raise taxes on working people. Technically, of course, it is a tax on companies, but it's a tax on companies employing people. So there's been lots of discussion about that. We're also expecting a number of tax squeezes on the better off, tweaks to the rules around inheritance tax and a capital gains tax. But the briefing suggests that she'll be cautious around all of this so as not to scare the horses. And the more radical change we're expecting is on the rules around investment spending. The UK's really had a woeful record on this, and Rachel Reeves wants the government to invest more. So she's likely to change the rules over how the government measures its assets. And that should allow her to have an extra 50 to 55 billion pounds headroom when it comes to investment spending. So that's quite a big change we're expecting to come as well.
Arguably, half of this is in the delivery, because up until this point, there have been criticisms that the way that Labour have played this is doom and gloom. The Tories dealt us a disastrous hand, and it's going to get much, much worse before it gets better. There is this fear, isn't there, that actually, regardless as to what Rachel Reeves has to do, and if she is serious about rebuilding an economy, which says she has evidence is in an absolutely parlous state, she has to make sure that everybody, from the local businessman to the capital, to the hedge fund manager, to the average worker, is going to have to trust her with this. I mean, how much trust is there in Rachel Reeves at the moment?
Yeah, I think politically it's been very difficult for the Labour Party because they wanted to make clear from the beginning that they've got a difficult inheritance, they've got a big gap to fill, and there will be painful tax rises. But the trouble is with this 4-month window, which I mentioned earlier, we've just had 4 months talk of doom and gloom about how bad things are, how big the tax rises are going to be, who's going to pay for it. And so, of course, all of that has not only made the government quite unpopular already, but it's also dented confidence in the UK economy to some extent. So lots of people are sort of worried that they're going to get hit with a big tax rise, and that affects spending, of course. So a very difficult tightrope for the government to walk. I think the number one objective for the Chancellor today is to avoid a Liz Truss moment when the markets crashed, literally as the Chancellor was delivering his budget a couple of years ago. Now, Rachel Reeves has been studiously careful in telegraphing all the big changes so that markets know what's coming. That's not to say that everyone in the business community is supportive. The CBI, an important business group, they've been criticising what they call a perfect storm of measures hitting them. We've not only got the employers' tax hike I mentioned before, but also a 6.7% rise in the minimum wage, we've been told. That's more than 3 times inflation. So a generous hike for people on low wages, and a large package of workers' rights. All 3 of those coming at the same time. So some of the business community not happy with that. But broadly, I think markets have been pretty unfazed so far. UK assets have been performing strongly this year, and the stability of a government with a large majority is seen as supportive for those markets. But after that chaos we saw in the mini-budget 2 years ago, I think the chances of a particularly ugly rabbit popping out of the hat is pretty low, to be honest.
Ewan Potts from Bloomberg, we wish you the best of luck for covering the budget this afternoon. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Just coming up to 16 minutes past midday, you're back with the briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, evidence has emerged of new forms of sabotage and a terrifying method of state-sponsored terror carried out by Russia. An investigation by the Polish newspaper Gazeta Wyborcza has revealed details of attempts to place explosives on board cargo planes. Mateusz Mazzini is writer-at-large at Gazeta Wyborcza and a lecturer in journalism at Collegium Civitas in Warsaw and a regular voice here on Monocle Radio. Good afternoon, Mateusz.
Afternoon, thanks for having me.
So just explain to us this story that your newspaper has broken about this plot effectively to blow up planes.
So it's quite a terrifying story indeed. It's the scoop that we published in the first page of our newspaper last Friday by my colleagues Marcin Rybak and Piotr Żytnicki. Really touches upon an international attempt by Russians to destabilize domestic cargo planes here in Europe through really just seemingly innocent shopping parcels. So basically the story touches upon three parcels that were dispatched, and we have that on good authority from German intelligence services, probably somewhere from the Baltics, likely Vilnius. And it was just a set of products acquired through probably one of the Chinese e-commerce platforms. All of these parcels featured a similar set of components, so Chinese manufactured massage pillows, erotic gadgets, and cosmetics. But what the controllers missed in all of these three cases was the fact that they also featured a remote detonation device that effectively transformed the parcel into a bomb. And they were dispatched through DHL, which is one of the largest parcel operators in this part of the world. And they all caught fire. Two of them were blown up. Luckily, they did not manage to be on board the cargo planes yet, because one of them that was actually dispatched to Lipsk in Germany didn't make it on time because the plane itself was late, and that was the only lucky coincidence that actually prevented a plane from exploding mid-air.
I think the astonishing thing about this, of which there are many astonishing things, let's be honest, but the fact that we talk an awful lot about state-sponsored terrorism which happens online, but there is a, dare I say it, old-fashioned nature to this.
Very much so. And I think what we need to pay attention to in this case is that the Russians most certainly mastered the level of using completely let's say non-military or non-intelligence related means of communication or really means of shipping products and to weaponize them for domestic terrorism or internal state-sponsored terrorism purposes, as you said, because we're talking about three different parcels, one which exploded just outside Warsaw, one which exploded in Lipsk, and one which caught fire just outside Birmingham in the United Kingdom. So that's clearly an international attempt, and it's not that these parcels weren't scanned or weren't checked. All of these products that come from China are undergoing rigorous checks and controls in all of the dispatch warehouses, of which there are many in Europe, and somehow the controllers missed that. And in the case of one of the parcels that actually exploded just outside Warsaw, we know for a fact that it must have contained something else beyond these seemingly innocent products, because 3 different units of firefighters were called to put down the fire, and it took over a day to actually get rid of all of the flames. So there must have been probably some sort of chemical substance inside the parcel as well that fostered the fire. And we see that this is no jokes anymore, because Russians are operating under the no limits principle very much. And I think in Britain, you know that very well, because that plays very much in line with what Ken McCallum, the head of MI5, just recently said, that we are going to experience mayhem on European streets due to extended levels of Russian sabotage. So this is just a piece of evidence of that.
Mateusz Mazzini, thank you so much as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. Let's bring you up to date now with the news that more than 50 people have died in floods in southern Spain. In some parts of Valencia, a year's worth of rain has fallen in just 8 hours. Well, David Ribó Pérez is assistant professor from the Universitat Politécnica in Valencia. A very good afternoon to you, David.
Hello, good afternoon.
Could you just bring us up to date with the latest where you are? And you've been affected too by this, haven't you?
Well, I'm actually living in Valencia, in the city. So actually the city has not been affected, and the worst affections are on the surrounding areas in the metropolitan area of Valencia, mainly in the west and in the south of the city.
Just explain to us how badly they've been affected. What's the picture like?
So the picture, it's like probably the worst climate crisis in Europe in the century and probably on the last decades. They just confirmed that over 60 people died, and probably there's going to be more of them. Actually, there's a lot of missing people at the moment. There's also several damages on infrastructure. There are villages that they do not have access through walking access, driving access, obviously no trains in the surrounding areas, many areas without phone connection, many areas without internet, and still many areas without water or electricity.
Tell us a little bit about, you mentioned the fact that more than 60 people have now been killed, which is a very high number, given just how well or how strong Spain's infrastructure is believed to be. What has this weather event said about Spain's readiness for extreme weather?
So actually the meteorological agency suggested already on Saturday and Sunday that it was going to be heavy rainfall and this climate event. And what happened is that no measures were taken at the local level during yesterday, in the sense of cancelling work or cancelling classes or sending alerts to not go into the roads. And what mainly occurred was that during the morning and the evening, a lot of rain occurred in the western part of Valencia, and all came down through tributary to the main river here. During the afternoon, when most of the people were going back home in the cars, and most of them got stuck in the middle of the rain and in the middle of the highways.
Tell us, therefore, what's gone wrong here, because you mentioned that you knew that this weather was coming, you knew that the rain was on the way, but no warnings were given. I mean, do we know why that happened, or why that did not happen?
Actually, we do not know why it didn't happen, or it did happen, or if they did know what was happening at that moment. But actually, for instance, like the university, one of the universities in Valencia canceled the classes on Monday evening. My university canceled the classes yesterday midday, but anything was happening but the official alarm sent by the administration occurred at 8:30 p.m. yesterday. So actually, we don't have an idea of why it happened, when we already knew that there were probably going to be floods in the southern part of Valencia based on the river and tributary data of flows.
David Ribó Pérez, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You were the briefing. Now, Brazil has just voted for new mayors over the weekend. All in all, who did better? Was it Lula's Workers' Party or its former President Jair Bolsonaro's far-right ideas still popular with the voters? On Monocle Radio's senior correspondent Fernanda Augusta Pacheco has all the answers.
There were many losers in this year's municipal elections in Brazil. Now, with all the votes counted in each one of the 5,570 Brazilian cities, with a new mayor, and a staggering 80% of them were re-elected, by the way, we can finally predict what to expect for the 2026 Brazilian presidential elections. First of all, the right is strong as ever, but a different type of right. Former President Jair Bolsonaro and his far-right ideologies were considered perhaps a little too further to the right for the majority of the electorate. The moderate pro-business center-right parties did very well, with parties like MDB and PSD winning the majority of minorities throughout the country. the left remains weakened. What people must understand about Brazil is that Lula is bigger than the left, perhaps because of his enormous charisma and, frankly, pragmatism. For Lula, there are no problems making deals with the center or even the center-right, unlike many members of his own Workers' Party. Many Brazilians are still thankful for Lula's social programs, who were implemented successfully in his first 2 terms. But as many commentators are saying, the left is losing touch with its bastions. People now think of their social programs as their right, and so they should. But some in the poorer communities like the discourse that you can become wealthy by your own good without the help of the state. It's the rise of the autonomous worker. It's not unlikely that Lula will try for a re-election in 2026, but in many ways the left and center-left should be looking out for new exciting leaders too. Guilherme Boulos in São Paulo didn't excite this time, losing to the not very popular incumbent Ricardo Nunes. Perhaps the youthful João Campos, who won comfortably in the northeastern city of Recife. To be seen. The pragmatic right won, and both Lula and Bolsonaro might need to rethink their electoral strategies to be competitive in 2 years' time. For Monocle, I'm Fernando Augusto Pacheco.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Fernando. The time here in London is 12:27 and you're with The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. Now, mountains, sea, plains and forests, the stalwarts of our geography, and as is widely assumed, some of the elements which govern the way the world operates. But now a new book argues that it's much more than that and hopes to reshape the way we look at the subject and indeed the way we look at our world. It's called Myths of Geography, and Paul Richardson is a geography lecturer at the University of Birmingham. He joins me on the line because he wrote the book. A very good afternoon to you, Paul.
Great to be on the show.
Just explain to us briefly, what's the current orthodoxy of the way that we look at the world? You're blaming the ancient Greeks for this, aren't you?
I think that's a product of a different time and a different place, but certainly the continuity of some of these ideas do endure to the present. Some of these, the book looks at some myths that are very new, but there are some, such as the myths of the continents, that we can trace back to the ancient Greeks. And also this idea that somehow the environment, the physical geography is the critical determining factor in terms of politics and culture, and how societies are shaped. But I try to widen the lens on that and challenge some of these prevailing ideas to bring back in the human agency, the history that creates our world, and how our imaginations and myths create a world that we live in.
Indeed. I mean, what is wrong with the current orthodoxy at the moment? I mean, it has been held for a very, very long time that a country is often its fate is often determined by the fact that if it wants to go and invade its neighbour, it's easier to do so if there isn't a set of mountains in the way, and access to water is something which is absolutely crucial. Is it because that these aren't just elements which determine the way that we function, or have we been getting it wrong all along?
I think that the physical geography, the location of rivers, mountains, of course, they've had some impact on human history, and the location of towns, cities, even civilizations has some relation to how the geography works. But the geography changes for a start. The world's climate is not the same over time, and humans innovate. Nuclear weapons, drones have changed the way of warfare, as has aerial technologies. So you can't write out the innovations, and also the ideas that motivate the states to act. The very idea of a nation is quite new and quite innovative. This was not something that we recognizable to some of the figures that we use today, like Richard the Lionheart, for example, outside of the Houses of Parliament. He's located there as this symbol of British history, daring do abroad, yet probably couldn't even speak English, was sort of selling the country, offering to sell the country at times, and wouldn't be recognizable wouldn't recognize the nation as it is today.
So tell us a little bit about, some of the elements that you want to re-explore. You mentioned there that there's the way that we see continents could do with revisiting, and it's which is rather disconcerting because it's always quite nice to know where you are. But also the idea of border walls, things that have worked well in the past or worked effectively in the past. Great Wall of China, Hadrian's Wall, the Berlin Wall, but now they're no longer as relevant or as powerful as they could have been.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the second point about the walls. I mean, first of all, there is this sort of popular misconception that that's the Hadrian's Wall with civilization on one side, barbarians on the other. But actually, it was in many ways a meeting point. It was a meeting point for local tribes to trade. It was a place that connected all over the empire. The garrisons that patrolled Hadrian's Wall were from as far afield as what is now Syria, Eastern Europe. The irony of how some of these groups are represented today in the media, yet they were at one point patrolling the borders of Britannia. And also there's little evidence that it was just simply a defensive wall. If anything, it was a symbol of the Roman Empire at the time. And it was also a way to extract taxation, to open the gates to let people through, but to extract taxation to communities that were beyond, tribes and groups that were beyond the direct control of the Roman Empire. So its defensive function is one role, and perhaps not the most primary one. Just as with the Great Wall, that it's certainly its western extensions in many ways helped protect the Silk Road and secure the Silk Road, which was of course opening China to trade with the rest of the world. So there's a way that we project the idea of borders today into the past, and walls just don't work. The U.S. border wall is a great example for that. That since the Trump days, parts of it have been blown down, gates washed away in floods. And actually, when Trump finished his first presidency, there was more encounters with migrants after he'd spent $15 billion on it. And it's only as good as the cutting edge technology that is a ladder. People get round walls. That doesn't mean they're not deadly. It certainly pushes people into extremely dangerous territory to get round them. It has really, really very real consequences. But it stops us focusing on the real issues. It stops us looking at at migration policy, looking at drugs policy that could help. For example, there have been reductions in migrant encounters this year, but most of the analysis suggests that's because Mexico is intercepting more of these migrants coming from Central America, and the Biden administration has changed the rules. So the wall is not the factor that's at stake, but we can't see beyond that to look at the policies about how, and where in the case of narcotics, where drug liberalizations occurred, there's been less violence. And the wall, we can't see beyond it. It becomes the central focus when actually the problems are very distant from it.
Paul, time is running out on us, and your book has 8 myths which you systematically explode. Before we all collapse into a moment of existential and geographical despair, give us a toolkit or some sort of solution that allows us to reshape the world without having to sort of watch it melt before our eyes beforehand.
Well, I may be already fallen into that state. But it's, I guess the book just wants you to look again at the world. It wants to look at some of the tall tales we tell ourselves about the world, that some of them are these constructions which we live and die by. We don't even recognize them as recently invented creations, that there's nothing permanent about the way that we live in. Yet, of course, the way we structure the world around the lines of sovereignty, nation, borders, how we measure the economy, they have immense implications on our politics, society, identity, and our geopolitics. And I guess I want to recapture that our fates are not simply determined by physical geography. It reduces our incredibly rich and complex world to these simplistic tropes, which lose so much. They miss the connectivities between us, the movement that has created human history. And in a way, I want to recapture this idea of Pangaea. And this was when the continents were all merged together, and will happen again in a geological timesphere when the continents reunite in one supercontinent. And that comes from the ancient Greek of all the world. And I think we need to look at a world both at the very local and at this global level and start to question some of the ways that we frame it at the moment.
Paul Richardson, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. And that's all the time we have for today's edition of The Briefing. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to our producer, Tom Webb. Our researcher was Sana Jamani and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. The Briefing is back tomorrow, but for now from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.